so happy we alive.
I believe that higher education is simply a form of voucher. It's kids with tuition dollars. Institutions are out to attract kids, and I would argue higher education in this country is the best in the world. Why can't we do that when it comes to public education? Let's make public education better. I say you do that by bringing about competition in that area. But what's the biggest head in the sand issue that we have in this country today? Well, the biggest head in the sand issue in this country today is the war on drugs. And I suggest to you that the war on drugs is an absolute miserable failure. Again, I remind you of the definition of insanity. Doing the same thing day after day, year after year, and somehow expecting different results. That's the definition of insanity. Apparently 74%, this was a poll done about a month ago, apparently 74% of Americans believe that the war on drugs is a failure. As governor of the state of New Mexico, and I'm not the only governor, I'm one of 50. When half of what we spend on law enforcement, half of what we spend on the courts, and half of what we spend on prisons is drug related, is there a bigger issue? I don't think there is a bigger issue. We're spending $50 billion a year on this war on drugs. $50 billion a year. If there was one thing that I would like you to take away from my talk here today, it's the following. Don't do drugs, all right? Don't do drugs. You're looking at somebody who hasn't had a drink of alcohol in 13 years, and not only don't do drugs, but I want to make a pitch to all of you to stop drinking. For those of you that drink even a few drinks a day, until you quit, do you really understand what a handicap that is? And I've done that, and I understand what a handicap it is, and I guarantee you I wouldn't be getting up at 4:45 in the morning, working out every single morning if I drank. I found that to be a tremendous handicap. And if any of you are smoking cigarettes, that is, I would ask that you stop smoking cigarettes. There's just nothing redeeming in it whatsoever. Nothing redeeming. Stop smoking cigarettes. It's a real handicap. But is anybody sending a positive message when it comes to drugs? Is anyone? Teachers, law enforcement, elected officials, parents? I mean, no. And yet 80 million Americans have done illegal drugs. 80 million Americans. I happen to be one of those 80 million Americans who have done illegal drugs. 54% of the graduating class of the year 2000 will have done illegal drugs. So in spite of this message of don't do drugs, people are using drugs. And again, I want to make a pitch to you. Don't drink alcohol. Please stop drinking alcohol. Just see what happens when you stop drinking for a while. And yet, let's not forget that at one point in this country's history, it was against the law to manufacture and distribute alcohol. And I don't think for a minute that alcohol use should be criminal. I don't think that for a minute tobacco use should be criminal. And kids, one of the huge criticisms is, Johnson, what kind of message are you sending to our kids here? Well, here's the message when it comes to kids is, don't do drugs. Don't do drugs, all right? And right in back of that is, I hope the message that we're sending to our kids is that we love our kids. And that's the message that I hope my kids have gotten, is that I love my kids, all right? And that when it comes to educating my kids on these substances, alcohol, tobacco, drug use, that we be honest with our kids when it comes to the education of our kids on these topics. And by honest, all these substances are like diminishing returns. First time you smoke marijuana, you know what? It's an okay thing. Smoke it a lot, it's an okay thing. But it's diminishing returns. The more you do of any of these substances, the less and less you actually get out of it. But we ought to be honest with our kids and tell them what these substances do. Without exception, we should be honest. And when it comes to my kids, you're in a situation, don't drink, but I'd be foolish not to recognize that my kids aren't going to consume alcohol. Statistically, our kids are going to try or do illegal drugs. My message is, you're in a situation where you're where you've done drugs, where you've drank, where you're in a bad situation, and you need a ride, call me. I'm coming to get you, no questions asked, because I love you, first and foremost. And that's the message that we ought to be sending to kids. We love our kids, all right? And then, you know, tobacco. I said don't do tobacco. The anti-tobacco people will tell us that 450,000 people are dying every year from their use of tobacco. You know, maybe that's an inflated number. That's a lot of people, but that's what the anti-tobacco folks will say. Apparently 150,000 people die every year from their use of alcohol. And that's not drinking and driving now, that's the health consequence of doing alcohol. And apparently 100,000 people die from their use of legal prescription drugs. Legal prescription drugs kill about 100,000 people a year. I mentioned that I'd broken my back. I was on Percocet for 3 weeks following the fracture of my back. And my gosh, I needed the Percocet. I mean, the pain was unbearable. I needed the Percocet. But when I quit the Percocet, I mean, this stuff had actually put clothespins on my bowels. And when I quit using the Percocet, it was 1 week before I was able to sleep again at night. And yet people use Percocet for years on end. Again, these are drugs that we need to help us through periods of time, but they do harm also. They can do a lot of harm. What I was shocked to find out was that cocaine and heroin causes about 8,000 deaths in this country every year. And I think people are shocked by that when they understand that hundreds of thousands of people every year die from tobacco, alcohol, legal prescription drugs, and when they find out that only 8,000 die from cocaine and heroin, I think they're taken aback by that they're really surprised that so few die. Well, the Drug Enforcement Administration will tell us that it's because of our policies on drugs that so few die. Well, again, I would argue just the opposite, that overdose is a function of prohibition, that an aspirin-sized dose of heroin today may give 3 heroin addicts a heroin high. That same aspirin-sized dose tomorrow may kill those same 3 heroin addicts because it's a different source, different quality, different quantity. I mean, it's prohibition that's killing us. Let's not forget that during the prohibition of alcohol, alcohol killed people. Bathtub gin, people were blinded by their use of wood alcohol. That doesn't happen. I mean, people still die drinking themselves to death, but it's a lot harder today. I mean, you really got to work at it. Well, what substances are doing the harm? Well, clearly, tobacco's doing the harm, alcohol's doing the harm, legal prescription drugs are doing the harm. Cocaine and heroin certainly have a harm associated with use. Marijuana, I'm afraid, doesn't even make the list. No recorded deaths from marijuana, although I'm sure that there are a few people that have smoked themselves to death on marijuana. It's just that it hasn't been reported, but that probably has happened. And yet, in spite of these statistics, which ends you up in jail? Well, what ought to end you up in jail, I mean, if we're going to criminalize anything, it ought to be tobacco, but we've criminalized the use of drugs. We've criminalized the use of marijuana. And so there are 1.6 million arrests every year in this country on drug-related crime. Half of those arrests, 800,000 of those arrests, are for marijuana. And half of those marijuana arrests are Hispanic. Tell me that half the users of pot in this country are Hispanic. No, they're not. And the point is that these laws are terribly discriminatory. If you're of color, if you're a black apparently and get arrested for drugs, there's a seven times better chance that you're going to end up behind bars than if you're Anglo. So again, these laws are terribly, terribly discriminatory. The Drug Enforcement Administration says that drug use over the last 20 years has been cut in half.